Good morning, students. So we begin, and today we have the topic is respiratory system. Respiratory system. It's a short topic, and we begin with overview of respiratory system. So what does it include? A respiratory system includes the lungs and respiratory tract. The lungs and respiratory tract. What is respiratory tract? A respiratory tract is a system of tubes which links the sites of gas exchange with the external environment. So we have oxygen in external environment, and we need to bring this oxygen to blood. And blood will carry this oxygen to all tissues and cells of human body. And here you can see that respiratory tract consists of different parts. It contains nasal cavity. It contains nasopharynx, larynx, trachea, and bronchi. Bronchi divides on bronchioles. And the lungs, which consist of respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, and small alveoli. And respiratory system has different functions. And all these functions can be divided on two big groups: respiratory functions and non-respiratory functions. So here you can see how many functions does it have. Respiratory system has the main function is respiration. The respiration is the main function, which means gas exchange. Gas exchange between environment, inspiration air, and blood. And we have exchanging between oxygen and carbon dioxide. Exchanging between the oxygen in the air and carbon dioxide from blood. And the respiratory system has other non-respiration functions. For example, function of conditioning of the air. Conditioning of the air. What does it mean? It means that respiratory tract can warm, moistening the air, and it can remove of some materials, for example, dust, bacteria. Next function, next non-respiration function, vocalization. Vocalization. So you know when the air passes through the pharynx and larynx, it makes vocal cords in larynx to vibrate, and it helps to produce sound and speech for human. It's very important function too, because our speech helps us in our life to survive. And vocalization is non-respirative function, but very important. Next function is sense of smell. Sense of smell. In nasal cavity, we have different parts. We have olfactory mucosa in olfactory region, which contains special sense cells, and we can feel the smell. This function important too, because we need to understand, for example, freshness of food, or sometimes some smell can tell us about danger. For example, smell of some gases which can be dangerous for human body. Next function is endocrine function. Endocrine function. Endocrine function provides by special cells which we can find in respiratory epithelium, endocrine cells. And these cells produce hormone. It can secrete, for example, prostaglandins. These hormones has local influence on respiratory system. The next function is protective function. Protective function means immune defense against infection, which provided by macrophages. Immune defense against viruses, bacteria. And the last non-respiration function is fibrinolysis. Lungs contain a fibrinolytic system that lyses clots in the pulmonary vessels. One additional function. And we can divide all respiratory system to two big parts. The first part or region is conducting portion. Conducting portion. Conducting portion consists of the next structures. Conducting portion consists of nasal cavity, nasopharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and terminal bronchioles. All this conducting portion consist of respiratory tract, provide two main functions. First function is conduit, through which air can travel and to and from the lungs. So conduction, the air, and condition the air as we told, it can warm, moistening this, and take off some particles like dust. Conduct and condition the air. And we have other region is respiratory portion. A respiratory portion. Respiratory portion includes respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, alveolar sacs, and alveoli. And alveoli. And now we will look to structure of the wall of the conducting portion in respiratory system. We can tell that it has the general structure of its wall, and it contains four principal layers. It contains four principal layers. It consists of tunica mucosa, tunica submucosa, fibrocartilage layer, and tunica adventitia. And what we can tell about tunica mucosa? Tunica mucosa consists of three sublayers: respiratory epithelium, lamina propria, and lamina muscularis or muscularis mucosa. Respiratory epithelium is pseudostratified columnar ciliated. Pseudostratified columnar ciliated. Most of epithelium columnar, but in the smallest airways, for example, like in small bronchioles, the epithelium will be cuboidal, but it will be still ciliated, or it will have brush cells. Microvilli on the apical surface, you can see apical surface and microvilli. Very important for removal of foreign particles from these ducts, respiratory tract. And respiratory epithelium contains not only from ciliated cells, it has mucous goblet cells, basal cells, endocrine cells, and stem cells. And we will discuss it later. Next, lamina propria. Lamina propria, which lay under basal lamina and epithelium, and it consists of loose connective tissue as usual. You can remember that lamina propria consists of loose connective tissue. In respiratory tract, lamina propria contains lymphoid aggregations. So it's aggregation of lymphoid cells, tissue. And these form part of the mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. Mucosa-associated lymphoid tissue. These lymphoid cells can produce immunoglobulin A. Immunoglobulin A. and this immunoglobulin has a role of defense against invading microorganisms, some bacteria and viruses. Immune defense provided by immunoglobulin A. And of course, lamina propria contain blood vessels. We can see capillary here. It contains nervous and lymphatic vessels too. And the last layer in tunica mucosa is lamina muscularis mucosa. Lamina muscularis mucosa consists of smooth muscle cells. Smooth muscle cells, and when airway diameter will decrease, the layer of smooth muscle cells will increase. It's increasingly prominent as the airway's diameter decreases. Next, tunica submucosa. Tunica submucosa. As you remember, tunica submucosa usually consists of loose connective tissue too. Loose connective tissue. But here on large airways, it contains serous and mucous glands. Serous and mucous glands. Especially on large bronchi and trachea. Large bronchi and trachea. You can see gland here. Mucous and serous glands. And there are less glands in the narrow airways, and they are not present beyond the tertiary bronchi, only in large airways. The next layer is fibrocartilage layer. Fibrocartilage layer. You can see fibrocartilage layer in the trachea and large and medium bronchi. Fibrocartilage layer decreases as the diameter of airway decreases, and it's absent beyond the tertiary bronchi. Fibrocartilage layer consists of hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage. And in trachea, it consists of rings which has C-shape, non-closed. In large bronchi, it consists of some cartilage plates. In middle bronchi, it consists of only island of cartilage. In small bronchi is absent. Bronchioles is absent. And the last layer is tunica adventitia. Tunica adventitia. Tunica adventitia, as you remember, consists of loose connective tissue which vascularized, has blood vessels, capillaries, nervous and lymphatic vessels. It's principal structure of all respiratory tract, but it has some differences between different parts. First, we will discuss again respiratory epithelium and different types of cells of respiratory epithelium. The main cells, they are ciliated columnar cells, ciliated columnar epithelium. There are about 80–85% of all cells in respiratory epithelium, they are ciliated columnar cells. And they have about 300 cilia on its apical surface. And their cilia can move mucus toward oral cavity. So you can see a lot of cilia on each cell, and they help to remove foreign particles which can be on the surface of epithelium. Between ciliated cells, we can find special mucus goblet cells. Mucus goblet cells. They produce mucus. This mucus covers epithelium and it helps to catch the dust, and it must moisten the air. Goblet cells and ciliated cells together helps to remove dust and foreign particles from airways toward the oral cavity. In deep parts of respiratory tract, we can find more brush cells. Brush cells. Brush cells have numerous microvilli on their apical surface, but they are shorter than cilia. They are shorter. And basal surface of brush cells is in contact with afferent nerve endings. Thus, the brush cells are regarded as a receptor cells. Brush cells as a receptor cells too. We can't see them on this picture. Next type, basal cells or stem cells. Here you can see them, basal cells or stem cells. They are located on the basal lamina, and their main function is differentiate into the other cell types. Differentiation into other cell types. So they provide regeneration of epithelium. They provide regeneration of the epithelium. And we have small granule cells in the respiratory epithelium too, which has numerous granules, and these cells constitute a population of cells of the diffuse neuroendocrine system. So these are endocrine cells or small granule cells. About structure of respiratory tract, we will discuss nasal cavity, trachea, and bronchi. First, nasal cavity. Nasal cavity. It consists of vestibule. You can see this small part. Vestibule, respiratory region, and olfactory region. Olfactory region. Vestibule is lined by stratified squamous epithelium. Stratified squamous epithelium, which can be keratinized. stratified squamous epithelium. This epithelium contains numerous hairs, not epithelium, this part of this vestibule in lamina propria has a lot of hairs, sebaceous and sweet glands, like skin, sebaceous and sweet glands. The next part is respiratory region. Respiratory region. Respiratory region lined by pseudostratified columnar ciliated epithelium. Pseudostratified columnar ciliated, like all respiratory tract. And it contains goblet cells. It contains goblet mucus cells which produce mucus. Lamina propria of this part vascularizing by many capillaries, and it helps to warm the inspired air. Lamina propria contains mucus and serous glands too. Mucus and serous glands. And in olfactory region, we have special sense cells which provide the smell, feeling the smell. The next part of respiratory tract is trachea. Trachea. There are 4 layers in trachea. As we discussed before, it has tunica mucosa, tunica submucosa, fibrocartilage layer, and tunica adventitia. And here you can see tunica mucosa, tunica submucosa, fibrocartilage layer, and tunica adventitia. In tunica mucosa, usually in trachea, we have respiratory epithelium, which is stratified, pseudostratified, columnar ciliated, with numerous goblet cells. It contains endocrine cells, basal cells. Next, lamina propria, which consists of loose connective tissue, lymphoid tissue inside it, and some glands, ducts. And muscularis mucosa. Muscularis mucosa. Next, tunica submucosa. Tunica submucosa consists of loose connective tissue and a lot of blood vessels. You can see here veins and arteries. It contains serous and mucous glands too. The next layer, fibrocartilage layer. Fibrocartilage layer consists of hyaline cartilage which forms 16 to 20 C-shaped rings. These rings are not closed, and their posterior ends connected by smooth muscle cells and connective tissue. It's important because the trachea goes together the esophagus, and when we swallow the food, it needs to place the esophagus extends, and it needs to have a place for this food in esophagus, and trachea provided because it's not closed. And the last layer is tunica adventitia. Outer layer is tunica adventitia. Tunica adventitia consists of loose connective tissue, as usual. Bronchi structure. Bronchi. So bronchi can be divided on different types according to their size and structure of their wall. First, trachea divides into two primary bronchi, which enter the lungs at the hilum. After entering the lungs, the primary bronchi give rise to three bronchi in the right lung and two in the left lung, and each of which supplies the pulmonary lobe. Pulmonary lobe. These lobular bronchi divide repeatedly and give rise to smaller bronchi, whose terminal branches are called bronchioles. Each bronchiole enters a pulmonary lobule where it branches to form 5-7 terminal bronchioles. And here you can see different types of bronchi. There are large, middle, small, and bronchiole. The wall of bronchi has features in each part of a bronchial tree. Large bronchi, like main primary bronchi, they have diameter from 10 to 15 millimeters. From 10 to 15 millimeters. It's a secondary segmental or tertiary bronchi. And like a trachea, they are lined by pseudostratified columnar ciliated epithelium. Pseudostratified columnar ciliated epithelium. It consists goblet cells which produce mucus and form mucus layer covering the cilia of ciliated cells. It contains basal cells which lay on basement membrane, dividing and regenerate this epithelium. And it contains endocrine cells too. Muscularis mucosa forms closed rings in large bronchi. Glands are numerous and the cartilage rings are replaced by isolated plates. So you can see on this picture the large bronchus. You can see pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium in the inner part. We can see lamina propria and muscularis mucosa, which contains smooth muscle cells, and fibrocartilage layer like isolated plates, big one, middle and small parts of isolated plates of fibrocartilage layer. Next, middle bronchi. Middle bronchi have diameter about 2 to 5 millimeters. Anatomically, it's subsegmental bronchi. The same, they have pseudostratified columnar epithelium, ciliated, but a little bit lower than in large bronchi. And it contains less goblet cells. Smooth muscle cells form crisscrossing bundles. And fibrocartilage layer contains only isolated islands. Only isolated islands. Small bronchi. Small bronchi has diameter less than 2 millimeters, like intralobular, and they covered by cuboidal epithelium. There are just a few goblet cells, and glands and cartilage are absent. But smooth muscle cells form circular bundles, and this smooth muscle controls the diameter of the conditioning passages. Terminal bronchioles. Terminal bronchioles. They are more distal part of the conducting passages, and their diameter less than 1 millimeter. And they are lined by cuboidal and lower epithelium. They don't contain goblet cells, but they contain Clara cells, special Clara cells. You can see on this picture. Clara cells. So, cartilage, glands, goblet cells absent. Lamina propria contains elastic fibers and smooth muscle cells. And smooth muscle cells spirally arranged. Clara cells non-ciliated, bronchiolar secretory cells. They have short microvilli and they can secrete glycosaminoglycans to protect the bronchiolar epithelium. and they are also responsible for detoxifying harmful substances inhaled into the lungs. So they have protective function. And again, here we can look to small bronchi, which has lower epithelium, sometimes columnar, sometimes it's cuboidal, lamina propria, and rings of smooth muscle tissue. Smooth muscle tissue. The next portion is respiratory portion of the respiratory system. Respiratory portion of the respiratory system. It consists of special structural and functional units Acini. Acini. Acini includes respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveolar sacs. And they are separated by thin layers of loose connective tissue. 12 to 18 acini form pulmonary lobule. Respiratory bronchioles and alveolar ducts. Respiratory bronchioles. Each terminal bronchiole subdivides into two respiratory bronchioles. Here you can see on this slide how it looks like on microscope slide. Respiratory bronchiole. And the respiratory bronchiolar structure is identical to that of the terminal bronchioles. But the wall of respiratory bronchiole is based with a number of alveoli where gas exchange occurs. So here we can see alveoli. And each respiratory bronchiole divides into alveolar ducts. Smaller alveolar ducts. They are lined by squamous epithelium, and the lamina propria surrounding the rim of the alveoli is a network of smooth muscle cells. The smooth muscle of the respiratory bronchioles and alveolar ducts regulates alveolar air movements. And smooth muscle disappears at the ends of alveolar ducts. Smooth muscle disappears at the distal ends of alveolar ducts. Alveolar ducts open into atria that communicate with alveolar sacs. And each of alveolar ducts gives rise to several alveoli. You can see a lot of alveoli on this picture. Alveoli. Alveoli are sac-like invagination of the respiratory bronchioles, alveolar ducts, and alveolar sacs. And they are densely packed together. Interalveolar septa form a common wall between adjacent alveoli. and these septa contain network of elastic fibers and blood vessels between alveoli. Neighboring alveoli may be connected to each other by small alveolar pores and alveoli lined by simple squamous epithelium. This epithelium consists of two types of cells, type 1 cell and type 2 cell. Type 1 cells, squamous alveolar cell. They are most numerous, about 97% of alveolar surface. They are the component of air-blood barrier. They are flattened and have a regular shape. Provide the gas exchange between air and the blood. And type 2 cells. Type 2 cells or great alveolar cells, they are round in shape and there are about only 3% of them. They are secretory cells. They can produce surface-active lipoprotein complex, phospholipoprotein, which called surfactant. Surfactant is a very important substance. It reduces surface tension and it prevents alveoli from collapsing during expiration. And here we can find brush cells. Brush cells are also present in the alveolar wall, but just a few. They may serve as receptors that monitor air quality in the lung. And alveolar macrophages or dust cells are found in the alveolar wall or free in the alveolar space. They are derived from blood monocytes. And the last part is air-blood barrier. What is air-blood barrier? Air in the alveoli is separated from capillary blood by components which form the air-blood barrier. And air-blood barrier exists in the gas exchanging region of the lungs. It exists to prevent air bubbles from forming in the blood and from blood entering the alveoli. And it forms by next layers. First of all, don't forget that alveolar cells type 1 covered by surfactant. So we can tell that surfactant is a part of air-blood barrier too. And air-blood barrier consists of next cells, of surfactant, of alveolar cells type 1 and their cytoplasm. Next part is fused basal laminae. Basal lamina of alveolar cells and basal lamina of endothelial cells. Two basal laminas. And cytoplasm of the endothelial cells. Cytoplasm of endothelial cells. This barrier, air-blood barrier, is permeable to molecular oxygen and carbon dioxide, both carbon monoxide and many other gases too. Okay, that's all about respiratory system. Thank you for your attention.